And welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and in this episode, I am talking with Dr. Zorana Pringle. She's a leading researcher in creativity psychology and author of The Creativity Choice, the science of making decisions to turn ideas into action. And whether you think you're creative or not, Zorana and I are talking about how motivation, attention, risk tolerance, and constraint shape the process of turning ideas into reality. We're talking about how creativity is more than just having the idea, it's about the execution behind it. And the two engines of creativity, motivation and attention. And we're talking about how creativity thrives not in total freedom, but with a balance of structure and autonomy. So if you're stuck at the idea stage, or if you're afraid to start working on that idea, this episode's going to help you reframe creativity as a process that you can definitely engage with and show you how to make progress one decision at a time. Well, it is my privilege to welcome to the show Dr. Zorana Pringle. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I am excited. We often talk about, well, we don't often talk about it, but we do touch on it from time to time. We talk about creativity because it's this thing that, there's always this question of, are you really creative? What makes someone creative? Is it talent? Is it a personality trait? Or is it something else entirely? But you're even coming at it from a unique angle with your new book, The Creativity Choice, the science of making decisions to turn ideas into action. And I think that subtitle is the key here, the science of making decisions to turn those ideas, that creativity, into action. Some would even say creativity doesn't stop with the idea. It's also part of the process of how you execute the idea. But I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. And yes, that is the intended reading of the subtitle of creativity is something beyond ideas. Ideas are not enough, even if they are important.
Yes. So one of the things that people often are talking about, again, with creativity, is they say, oh, I'm not creative. And they stop there because they see it as someone else is. That's their talent. That's their gift. They're the gifted ones. And it's because they come up with the ideas. But really, I would almost say creativity is more, anybody can have ideas. It's the people that can make the ideas happen that are actually maybe more creative or maybe more persistent in creativity or resilient.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, really. Yes, indeed. There are lots of people who have ideas, but there are also lots of people who let those ideas stay inside their heads or share them over a drink with a friend. And don't follow up on them or don't start and don't finish. All kinds of scenarios are possible, and many fewer ideas than we have end up being developed.
You say this in the book, we don't live and we don't work by inspiration alone, although most people, I think, act like it. They use words like inspired or momentum or things like that, where it's some exterior force that causes me to then get something done towards a project or an idea.
Inspiration is certainly important. Inspiration is something that gets you going, but then you have to continue going. If inspiration is sort of a spark, you need to have a spark to start the fire and then maintain it. Otherwise, it's going to die out.
Why do you think that is that we glorify that idea stage or that inspiration stage, but kind of ignore the portion of creativity that is execution?
There's something cultural about it that in the United States, where we are speaking, and in Western European countries, there is this emphasis on the individual and on thinking. And we talk about creativity in terms of thinking. And then ideas are the logical place to go. And then as we talk more about it in the culture, it reinforces itself. We associate creativity with slogans, think different and think outside the box. And that has consequences. But there are other places in the world where there's much more influence and much more emphasis on effort, on this is hard work. It takes apprenticing, it takes learning, it takes developing the skill. So that's how we form ideas, and then we adopt them. It becomes the starting point from which we go into deciding whether we potentially could do something creative or not. And those choices, that's why the title of the book is The Creativity Choice. It's not one choice. It is, you start with a choice, and then it's a continuous process of decision making. At each point, you're asking yourself, can I do this? Is this worth it? And it's a conversation on figuring that out.
That it's almost an ongoing process, an ongoing creative journey. And you talk about this, the early social conditioning shapes the way that we are open to or willing to be creative. What are some of those things that, if that happened to us, or if some of our early social conditioning made us feel like we aren't creative at all, or only lean in on that, looking at it as an inspirational process only, the idea stage, how can we start to get out or shake off that social conditioning?
It's with effort. Essentially, the social conditioning is teaching us ideas about what creativity is, what it could be, and whether we could rise to the occasion. So let's think of what it looks like. Well, one thing is, you already mentioned it. Creativity means being artistic. Creativity is, I oftentimes hear when I say to people that I study creativity, they say, oh, that's cool. You should talk to my wife, my daughter, or, somebody, because they are more artistic. They can draw beautiful pictures. I am not artistic either. I cannot draw. It does not mean that I am not creative. And one of the points of my book is to say, yes, art and artistry is creative, but there are many, many other places where creativity exists. Creativity really is something that is original in some way, but also effective. Just being original, something that is bizarre could be original only. So it has this effectiveness component too. Another element of social conditioning is how we talk about role models about creativity. And oftentimes, I think most often, we talk about the Steve Jobses and, Coco Chanel's, Marie Curie's, and continue that line of people who have really changed our culture in some major important way or influenced history. And think about it. If you are a very small child, 4 or 5 years old, perhaps you can imagine yourself being anything. You can imagine yourself being a dragon. But once we start having self-reflective ability, we can realize that that's not us, or that's not likely to be us. And if those are the only role models of creativity we put forth, then it's not strange to conclude that's not me. It must be something that they are born with, and must be therefore something I am not born with, and therefore I am not creative. We are trying to inspire, and a byproduct of it is actually discouraging creativity.
Yeah, and if we look at those models or examples of people and we see how different they are, or how other they are when they approach things, it's more that they took a risk than it is that they're different from us. And you talk about that in the book, actually, that creativity requires risk in like 3 different ways, like intellectual, social, and emotional. How do we start to then tap into the courage to take more risks, to become more creative?
The starting point in taking more risks is to know that creative individuals are not necessarily natural born risk takers. Actually, research shows that it doesn't come naturally and that they are better described as risk tolerating than actively risk seeking. And you mentioned different kinds of risks. There are two main kinds of risks that we take in creative work. One is, can I do this? There is a risk that you will not be able to develop that idea that you have, learn what needs to be done, figure out how to do something. And why that is not because you are not intelligent, it's not because you are not capable in general. It's because creative work, by its very definition, is something new. It's something original. There's no blueprint to it. There's no set of steps. Only if you follow these steps, well, some things is going to happen. And you cannot be sure. Having doubt means that you are testing reality. And the other kind of risk is social risk. And that one is very intuitive. It is, what are people going to say? If I share ideas, if I show my work, if I take this different direction. And again, there is no way to know. Sometimes people surprise us by how supportive they are. Sometimes they surprise us by how critical they are. It comes to willingness to tolerate that risk and accept that we don't have to be comfortable. We just have to jump into it a bit.
And it's also about not necessarily just saying, okay, I'm open to any and all risks. There are different levels of risks. There's minor risks, there's moderate levels, there's high levels. If someone were to say gambling, well, all gambling, it's like, oh, if I'm going to throw down thousands of dollars, that's high risk, especially. And then scenario comes into it too, like how much of a risk it actually is. So there's a lot of different dynamics there. How much you're wagering, as well as which game and how much skill you have. And is it all skill or is it all luck? There's a lot of variables when it comes to risk. So figuring out a way to nudge yourself towards more risk tolerance, maybe with low stakes risks, like coming up with an idea, working in a team, executing on it, putting it out there in public, but putting it out in a forum these are friends, so it's a safe space, is the first kind of brainstorming I can come up with that could help people become more tolerable or increase their risk tolerance.
I think that is a great example. So we learn to be more tolerant by trying, by acting, by seeing what it's going to be like if we take this risk and then seeing what actually happens. Oftentimes, most often, nothing dramatically tragic happens, and we can have a moment of reflection to say, okay, this was possible to do, this was okay to do, and it can enable us, give us that emotional strength to do it again in a different situation.
One of the things, aside from risk, that I was interested in hearing that you were talking about in the book was this idea that there are these dual engines of creativity. And these are two topics that we've talked about on this show a lot, one being motivation and then the other being attention. Can you speak to those two dual engines and how they work in this scenario?
So the creative drive has two parts, like you are describing. One is motivation, which is akin to energy. It is what gets you going and makes you move, engage in something. But then there's also that attention or focus part, which is, okay, you have this energy, but where are you going to put it? How you're going to channel it? And in terms of motivation, what is really important for creative work is doing something that you enjoy doing, that is a challenge, and that challenge becomes a source of pride and satisfaction. That does not mean that you are enjoying every single moment of it. Published a book, I wrote a book. It is a really hard process and a long-lasting process. And not every part of it was enjoyable. There were parts that were frustrating and difficult. But overall, it was a challenge I wanted to take and that I approached willingly and with excitement. And then it's okay, now this is going to get you going, but how do you hone it in? And there are strategies to direct your thinking and your action towards more original outcomes. And they're a little bit counterintuitive. There was this recent study that I absolutely loved that looked at what people believe about creativity across 6 different cultures all over the world. And they found that a very strong finding that about 70% of people across different countries believe that creativity is the greatest when people have full freedom of action. The exact opposite is true. And I find repeatedly that is very counterintuitive. If you search for creativity memes online, they're all about freedom and, throwing paints against the wall type of thing, just playing. And occasionally, there are sometimes and some aspects of the creative process that could be like that. But really, it is not. Creativity is actually higher. Creativity of outcomes is higher if we have some constraints on our work.
Yes, and this is the other key piece I was going to bring up was these constraints can often be something that we hear the word constraint and we hear constrain, like hold in one place. And that's like stifling. It's like, but instead having those guardrails is kind of the way I like to think about it is, well, no, you come up with some interesting ideas. If you put some boundaries up and say, okay, what if you can just do it inside of here? You even talk about this with an example in the book. I believe the name is Shaminda, something like that. She's they're a Broadway technical designer. Can you illustrate a little bit with their story?
Yeah, so Shaminda is a production designer, and he is on the faculty of Yale School of Drama with really impressive credits to his name, including major Broadway shows. He is working with the technical side of theater. He makes possible those things that create the atmosphere of theater. Essentially, he creates the magic of what gets us into the experience of a show. And so he was telling a story when he worked on the King and I production on Broadway. An artist came to him with sketches of what they wanted the scene to look like. And his goal, they were very abstract looking sketches. He has to make it to fit the artist's vision, but in the same time, obey the laws of physics and make it possible to be built. It's not just to be built, but this is going to be a show that runs 8 times a week. It has to be stable, it has to be sturdy, it has to be fixable so that when pieces fall off or get used up, it can be changed and it can be refreshed. So he had to work with all of those things at the same time, which directs that energy and that creative drive in a particular direction. We can think of other examples, just to stay with the simplest possible example that sometimes is used by creativity researchers, studying the process of coming up with new ideas. And these are oftentimes game-like exercises. So let's think of all the uses you can think of for a knife. So where would you start? Where would you start if I say, think of all the uses you can think of for a knife?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is, I think, just a butter knife, putting butter on toast.
There you go. And you have started in a place that pretty much everybody starts.
Right.
Because that's how the mind works. We start with what is obvious. We start with, if we are talking about some objects that can have particular, label functions. We start with those label functions. So we use it for spreading something or for cutting something. But we start with something that is rather conventional. If we are fully free, that's where the mind goes. But imagine if I told you instead, if I constrained your thinking and said, okay, think of uses of a knife as a gardening tool.
Maybe to help with weeding.
There you go. Isn't that a great use? And your mind wouldn't have gone there on its own. The constraint made you go there.
Right.
And the constraint is pushing you, directing, focusing your thinking towards more original areas.
Well, and that leads me to the Goldilocks zone, which you talk about. Essentially, it's kind of the right amount of challenge and constraint and direction and all the motivation and inspiration. It's the right, it's the Venn diagram, if you will. We bring those up all the time. All these different circles. Talk a little bit about how we get into that Goldilocks zone or find that for ourselves.
We experiment. To get into the Goldilocks zone of risk, we talked about earlier, there are levels of risk. You don't want them to be too high. You don't want them to be too low. Too low, and it's going to be conventional. Too high, it's not going to be achievable. We talk about the Goldilocks zone of being just right when we talk about the level of challenge. If it's too little of a challenge, you're not going to do anything original. You're not pushing yourself. If it is too much, it might not be achievable because the technology does not exist, or you don't have the right skills, or whatever else it might be. How do you find that zone? There isn't I cannot give you a number. I cannot tell you this is a set of steps to follow, because these are pretty individual things. You are going to develop risk tolerance with time, and therefore your ability to take risks and willingness to take risks will rise with time and experience. The same thing for a level of challenge when you're doing something. To use a personal experience, this is the first book I wrote, and writing a book is a big challenge. So I did not start with a challenge of writing a book. I started a challenge of first learning how to communicate to the general audience, people who are not just scientists. That was the first challenge, writing blog pieces. And then the next challenge, now greater risk and greater challenge, was to write a book proposal with sample chapters for the book. And then the biggest challenge of writing the book itself. So all of these goalposts are going to change with time, and you have to try it out. And sometimes you're going to fail. That's okay. Sometimes you're going to bite more than you can chew. Well, then maybe you spit it and try again with a little bit smaller bite. But it's a matter of development.
Yeah. It also, one of the things that creativity is often compared to or talked about as a process of problem solving. But in the book, you talk about problem finding. A lot of us are like, I don't want to find more problems. I already got enough. What do you mean by this?
I think that the scientific term, problem finding, is a little bit of a misnomer and in a way unfortunate. But, sometimes scientific terms stick even when we could perhaps find a better one. So problem finding has two parts to it. One is that finding where problem is not necessarily, something that is a crisis and you have to deal with. Sometimes it could be, but it's also a topic or a spark that you want to work on. Sometimes people identify it as an opportunity. So identifying a starting point is the first part of problem finding. The second part of problem finding is a more continual process of exploring, looking at that topic or spark or opportunity from different angles, from different perspectives. A colleague of mine, Ronnie Ryder-Paulman, who's an organizational psychologist, has done a study of problem-solving teams. So they all received the same problem and they had to solve it, come up with ideas, select ideas, and then these ideas were judged for how creative and effective they were. And they found that most of the time in team discussions was not spent on coming up with solutions. It was spent with discussing the problem itself. People were checking in about their understanding of the problem formulation, how they interpreted it. Inevitably, they discovered that there are different interpretations or different angles at it. They really went back and forth about getting on the same page, seeing how different formulations could be helpful for problem solution. Sometimes from the ways we formulate the problem, solutions emerge itself. And 53% of the time in discussions of successful problem solvers was spent on problem finding.
It strikes me as maybe a different version or very similar related to the conversation part that we were having about constraints, where you're going to come up with things you wouldn't have thought of in the same way as constraints. You'll come up with them in problem finding because you're reframing the question. You're changing, in other words, if I ask that question just a little bit differently, I'm going to get this whole other range of answers that would never have been considered had I not reframed it.
Exactly. This is a very good way of looking at it, and it opens up thinking to new possibilities.
Yes. And then having those new possibilities, again, this is one of those things where it's like the idea side of things, but you can even see that focusing on the idea side of things, coming up with the idea alone, and that being the be-all, end-all myth of what creativity is. But even in that process of reframing or finding, as you call it, the problem, the new problem, or the better way to put it, that's a process. That's execution, even in the ideation stage of things.
Yes, it is. You have mentioned several things here. Sometimes people use the word execution. I think it has some connotations that might not be helpful. So think of, you hear the word execution, what does it mean? It gets us to think of, there is an idea, there is a path, just do it. As if everything is there, you are just executing it. But it's not just anything. It is a process of developing, changing the frame, expanding the frame, and only then ideas start to emerge and things that you are building starts to change. Like, to go again with the example of writing a book, the ideas for each of the chapters that I started with were not exactly the same as I ended up with. In the process of writing, you realize that some have to be split into 2 chapters and some have to be merged into 1, for instance. Or that a new topic that you did not think of before really should be its own thing. The same thing happens in making a movie. I love the Pixar movies and I love the accounts of the process that they go through. And it is not that Pixar is different in how they do things. They are just open to sharing that the original spark, the original idea, almost nothing ends up being left of it in the final product, because it is not just executing, it is a continuous development process.
One of the things that I've found in terms of creativity that people often get stuck on, and it's directly related to that word stuck, is creative blocks. And you talk about that in the book and how blocks are normal, in fact, even essential to the creative process. How is a creative block essential? Why do we need them?
We don't necessarily need them. So they're not essential in that way. They are essential in the way that you almost cannot avoid them. Yes, they could be occasionally a relatively smooth process in doing something, but very often it is not smooth and they are essentially stoppages. How scientists define the creative block is failure to make progress temporarily, not because of a lack of ability or skill. So it is not that you're not equipped to make progress, but something has happened that came in the way. If you think of creativity as walking through a maze, sometimes you get into a blind alley and you have to retrace, take a new approach, take a new route. And that's really what happens in the process of a creative block. It is not essential in the way that it has to happen, but it very often happens.
So in other words, we should feel that it's essential in the same sense that we shouldn't feel like it's unexpected or the end of a process. We should feel like it's a natural part that occurs as part of the process, if and when it happens.
Yes, if and when it happens, you can remind yourself, but this is very hard to do. This is not saying, oh, just remember. It is very hard to remind yourself that it is what happens to many people in many kinds of work and in many situations. And it is not unusual. It is not diagnostic of your lack of ability or a unique problem to you or to your project.
So, one, I think, dealing with it is going to have to do with changing our perspective on it and adopting the perspective that a creative block can happen. And if it happens, it's okay. We will move through it. But then two, how do we work through it once we've got that perspective and it does happen?
So for that perspective to happen, you need to take the edge off emotionally. Creative blocks are experienced as overwhelmingly frustrating. And you can get yourself kind of worked up in a frenzy. And it's challenging and very unpleasant. If you start by giving yourself some slack and saying, instead of saying you should have known better, say, well, this sometimes happens and it's going to be temporary. If you take just enough of that edge off, you can start using different strategies to expand your thinking. And the most effective one is taking a break. It's a hard one to do because most of us have this sense of, I don't have the time to take the break. There are pressures, and these pressures are real. On our time, on meeting deadlines, competing priorities. And so it feels that you cannot take a break. However, if you don't, you are unlikely to truly emerge in the quickest possible way from this place of being stuck. So what I try to tell people is that taking the break does not necessarily have to be you go on vacation, does not have to be that you even go on a long walk. It seems to be very popular these days to tell people to go on a walk. And sure, a walk can be good. I'm not saying it cannot be good, but you don't have to. You can just work on something else on your to-do list. The point of taking a break is taking a break from the thing that you are stuck on.
Well, and one of the things that can help is maybe you take that break with friends. And that brings me into the insight that often the creative process is not something you do alone, although we often think of it that way. Although we think of, brainstorming as a group activity often. That goes back to the holding up a higher importance on the ideation phase only. But that you talk about how creativity is inherently social.
Creativity is social even when it does not seem to be. If you are doing something creative that is solitary, you are in front of your computer, creating a design, writing something in front of a canvas, does not matter what it is. You are the only one who's creating it actively. But you are influenced in direct and indirect ways by your social surroundings or social influences. People you have talked to, people you have discussed your ideas with. those things. I'm a scientist. We get inspired from previous research, finding inconsistencies, discussing ideas at conferences, getting feedback. Those are some direct and some indirect ways their social influences on our work. And we have to acknowledge them because there is no creativity in a vacuum. We are always living in a social world and influenced by it. That is partly humbling. We should acknowledge that we are not uniquely spectacular, even when we are great at something, but also it is something that we can take advantage of and we can use as a tool to increase our creative work.
Well, I think that people grabbing this book would be a great tool for their creative work. And I would love to point people to where they can find out more about you and your work and connect with you, but also where they can pick up the book.
Thank you very much for saying that. I think that learning some lessons about how creativity functions can free you from those socially imposed misleading ways of thinking about it. The book can be found anywhere that you normally like to find books. So from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your independent bookstore. I would love if you could share the link to the book in your episode notes. And that way people are very welcome to connect with me on various platforms.
For sure. I can definitely do that. And Zorana, it's been great talking with you today. And I hope that this is a great nudge for a lot of people out there in terms of opening up their creativity in ways that they hadn't thought of, but then also executing more so and more emphasis on that, I think. And that's a great example you've given.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. And I hope that you are walking away from this conversation with insight into the creative process as well as the execution process of creativity. Definitely pick up Zorana's book, which you can find the link to in the show notes. And I'm sure somewhere along the way, something about this episode sparked an idea that you've got to share with somebody else. And do me the favor of sharing this podcast episode with them. Hit that share button in the show notes over at beyondthetodolist.com or wherever you're listening to this in your podcast player app of choice. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next episode.